It's not just about numbers. Yes, there are numbers, and you've got, something like, you see different estimates, but call it 60, 70,000 in the Twin Cities. But it's also the fact that this is a community, and look, this is a super, you want to talk about this really carefully and thoughtfully.
Right.
So you have a population that came into the country as refugees. Now you also have a second generation population as well. You have folks who are family members of those early refugees who arrived, et cetera. But you have a population that has really thick clan relationships. And what I mean by that is, with a lot of immigrant populations, you have someone who's the pioneer who moved, and then there are other folks. It's like, hey, come jump in. The water's fine. Come in. Let's do this together. But the first folks who come, typically they're ones who are like, I'm leaving whatever was behind, and I'm going to make my way, and I'm going to honor my culture, but I'm also just going to try to get a job and rub shoulders with other people from other groups. Here you have a population that was really traumatized. You had a population of folks coming from a really rough neighborhood. I mean, Somalia is a country
a horrific civil war in Somalia. They had
state collapse.
Brutal communist regime.
Exactly.
To the extent that you could call it ideological at all, but an extremely brutal regime.
Exactly.
All of these people fled from it. It's been civil war ever since. It has not been really a unified country ever since.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, what do you do in that situation? Well, what happens is, you cling together, you work together. And also, by the way, you might also be pretty suspicious of governments, right?
Sure.
So then you suddenly come to another society, another country, where, again, you have this big population, very tight-knit, not a ton of assimilation as such. You're living in communities that are really dominated by other co-ethnics. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Sure.
But in this case, it was this really toxic, combustible combination where you're really isolated. You don't necessarily trust government. And you have the situation where people say, hey, we're going to give you free money. We're going to give you free money, and all you have to do is tell these outsiders in the government that I'm doing this when I'm doing something else.
Right.
And I'm not saying that everyone was a perpetrator of fraud, but there were enough people who were, and their mentality might have been, I'm supporting my clan.
Are you talking about like tens of thousands of people or something? What are you talking about?
I hesitate to give you a definitive answer on that.
Yeah.
I will say that there were certainly a lot of people involved who were aware, and there are a lot of people who, people said, hey, why don't you take part in this?
Yeah.
Who said, no, I'm not going to do that, but who also didn't go to the government.
Yeah.
They didn't go to local law enforcement. And it's one of these really interesting situations that arises when you have a population that's coming from a really different cultural context,
Sure.
really different set of circumstances, and then comes here to a different set of circumstances, and then you're kind of adapting and learning. And then you have some folks within the community who might have been pretty cynical, who might have found, hey, if I just accuse people of racism, then we're not going to get scrutinized, and then we can keep extracting. Then you have other people who are just thinking, hey, I don't know where this is coming from, but I just got to buy a new Jeep. I'm happy about that. So,
sure. No, I get that. It's kind of the story of America in a way, just in terms of a side story. Let's call it a B plot or a C plot. But I'm talking about, there's a lot of, how the president has been talking about this and things like that and everything. It's like, oh, this is how Somalis are, and this is just like, this is how they function as a group, and we can't trust them, and we can't bring them in. And I hear this story, and I'm like, okay, this is a scandal. If this were 100 years ago, the Irish and the Italians would have been doing this like crazy.
Well, Will, that's the whole ball game right there, which is that 100 years ago, it was just harder to do this because, you did have, Tammany Hall,
right?
You had, you certainly had that, but look, it was not operating on the same scale for this reason.
Sure.
Okay, so Minnesota, when you were starting this food aid program, you were not doing it with Minnesota tax dollars exclusively. You were also doing it because, the federal government pours a bucket load of borrowed federal dollars on top of you. So where's the accountability? Because even if you're thinking about Tammany Hall, they had to make the numbers work. They had to make the graft work, right? Because they didn't have like a 7% of GDP deficit being poured in here. And also, when Tammany Hall was doing it, they expected something in return. you do this for me, and then you're going to kind of turn out the votes. That's one thing. But there's also other reciprocal relationships. I'm not saying those people were somehow morally superior. I'm saying the circumstances were so different when government was not nearly as large as it is, where you didn't have this kid gloves attitude as well. Because back then, you had these ethnic mafias. You did. But you also were able to speak frankly about it, and you were able to exactly, and get pushback around it. And again, it was this situation where, well, look, we know the score, and there's going to be some reciprocity, and there's going to be some trade-offs as well in how we manage this. Whereas here, it's a community that was so isolated because you had, these other Minnesotans, black, white, and brown, by the way, who are just terrified. And who are kind of like, well, I'm not going to believe my own lying eyes. Or who am I to say? Who am I to question?
Sure,
how this
nobody
is
wants
done?
to. But like the essential problem here is, okay, like so Tammany Hall delivered votes in exchange for graft, and these guys didn't really ask for anything. They weren't helping out Tim Walz. They weren't helping out Joe Biden.
They wanted votes, I'm sure, and they also wanted,
Well,
occasionally
no, I
a
mean,
campaign
like,
contribution.
did this help Tim Walz in any kind of way? I mean, it's certainly a huge embarrassment for him now.
This is a really interesting question. I think that there's one cynical view was that it was purely transactional, and I think I agree with where I think what you're driving at, which is that, maybe there's a little bit of that, but actually a lot more of it was, we're benevolent, we're benign, we're good people, this is what we do. And, I accept the premise that Tim Walz would be racist if I said, hey, let's scrutinize this a little bit.
Yeah.
You buy into this worldview, and it's partly a product of our polarization because, when you decide that the other guys on the other side are so rancid and terrible and awful, then it's sort of like, well, anything that hints of something that they might do, which is, have the green eye shade and be a little skeptical and, call out BS, suddenly becomes suspect.
The president, the way he was talking about just no more Somalis, this is how the Somalis are, that's not so great.
Look, I agree that you always want to treat people as individuals.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. Think about it as a guilt-based culture versus a shame-based culture. Think about it as the way that our society works is not that the IRS is going to audit you every single second.
Sure.
They're trusting that Will Rahn is basically going to do the right thing when he pays his taxes.
Wow, that's a terrible idea.
But that is, and it might be right, it might be foolish,
this is
but it's
the social
basically how the
construct.
system
Yes,
works.
exactly.
And I think that, when you think about assimilation, what it means, the idea is that, you're assimilating, yes, maybe, you're learning to appreciate the NFL or you're learning to celebrate Thanksgiving. But part of it is the idea that you're assimilating to certain norms of civic culture. About how we do things here, how you relate to government and what have you. And I think that the thing that's really hard is that it's both true that there's absolutely rancid racism against Somalis and other groups. But then there's also this other thing, which is that it's actually really, really hard to assimilate when you have had no experience of developing the civic culture over time into a society that really depends on that for things to work.
Right.
And so there's somewhere in between here where we need to be able to have a frank conversation about the fact that actually with some groups, you're going to need to do more work.
Sure.
In order to incorporate them into that civic culture. And you can't just take it for granted that's going to automatically happen. And you also can't say, how dare you possibly suggest that for someone to move from Toronto, to the Twin Cities is not exactly the same as someone who arrived from rural Bangladesh.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Without any experience of living in a kind of urbanized civic culture. They're different. And that doesn't mean that one is necessarily irremediably bad or evil.
No.
What it does mean is that if you pretend that they're not different, here's what's going to happen, Will. Someone's going to point out, gosh, they're different. And these people who are telling me that there's no difference whatsoever are going to be discredited in my eyes. That, I think, is the really dangerous thing that's happened. So the people who want to have an inclusive society, the people who want to have a pluralistic society, they're the ones who need to actually be able to draw distinctions and talk about reality. Because if they don't, it's going to be the people who are saying that anyone who's darker than this skin tone should not be allowed off the airplane. That's what's going to happen. But just like, I think that, here's the basic simple thing. You need to just have a broad consensus that, this kind of fraud on a grand scale is really bad, and the people who turned a blind eye to it, they're really, really bad.
Yeah.
And they're not helping Somalis. They're not helping Bengalis. They're not helping anyone by doing that, by turning a blind eye to it. What they're doing, it's a balm for their conscience.
Yeah.
They thought they could extend and pretend and get away with it and kind of gut it out. And we understand things is happening, but maybe no one's going to call us out on it, and maybe it's going to be okay. It's kind of like the grooming gangs in the north of England.
Yeah,
it's just like maybe no one will actually point out that this was this massive scandal that actually did have a cultural dimension.
Yeah.
So then you're just relying on people to be blind or idiots.